was in remission after only 3 months. I've been asked by many patients over the years if it's possible to heal one's thyroid in just a few months. What this episode is about is having realistic expectations while healing your thyroid. And of course, most thyroid conditions are actually autoimmune in nature. Most people with hyperthyroidism have Graves', most people with hypothyroidism have Hashimoto's. So it's not just about healing the thyroid, but reversing the autoimmune component. In the case of Graves' and Hashimoto's, you want the antibodies to be negative. And I admit this isn't easy to accomplish. It takes time. Some cases are more challenging than others. It's not only about how high the antibodies are. If everything else looked good, but they had elevated streptococcus on a GI map, which is actually a common finding, or even low Akkermansia, which is also a common finding on these tests. That, to me, I wouldn't say, well, if they're not in remission. Hey, this is Dr. Eric, and in this Q&A episode, I am going to answer the question, is it possible to heal your thyroid in 3 months or less? And I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it's likely that you might see someone who said, hey, I was in remission after only 3 months, or sometimes even 2 months, or again, 4 months. And what it comes down to is the definition of healing. What does it mean to be healed, to restore one's health? And so there are a few things I look at. And really what this episode is about is having realistic expectations while healing your thyroid. And of course, most thyroid conditions are actually autoimmune in nature. Most people with hyperthyroidism have Graves', most people with hypothyroidism have Hashimoto's. So it's not just about healing the thyroid, but reversing the autoimmune component. And in most cases, it's going to take a lot longer than 2 or 3 months. Even in the case of certain non-autoimmune thyroid conditions, such as toxic multinodular goiter, it's typically going to take a while to help someone restore their health. And so one thing, obviously, we do want to look at are the thyroid levels. We want the thyroid panel to be optimal, T3, T4, TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. So we want those to be within the optimal range, but just having optimal thyroid hormone levels alone doesn't confirm this. That doesn't mean someone has restored their health. Even though I see it all the time where someone, again, in a Facebook group might say that the endocrinologist told them they were in remission, but they didn't even look at the antibodies in the case of Graves' or Hashimoto's. They just looked at the thyroid and concluded because the thyroid looked good that they were in remission. More so in the case of Graves', where someone will be put on anti-thyroid medication for a while, for let's say 18 months. And then at that point, maybe they don't need the anti-thyroid medication. The numbers might look good, but they haven't tested the antibodies. And the next thing I wanted to talk about is that ideally, in the case of Graves' and Hashimoto's, you want the antibodies to be negative. And I admit this isn't easy to accomplish. It takes time. Some cases are more challenging than others. It's not only about how high the antibodies are. I mean, yeah, when I do prefer seeing lower antibodies, but sometimes it can be challenging when someone has lower antibodies. And sometimes it's not as challenging when someone has really high antibodies, because it really all comes down to finding and removing the triggers, doing things to heal the gut. But yeah, so like antibodies being negative is something that I look for. And like I said, sometimes it does take, I mean, usually it does take a while, and sometimes it's more challenging than others. And then other underlying imbalances should be addressed. So my situation, when I dealt with Graves' disease back in 2008, 2009, in 2008, I did an adrenal saliva test and everything was low. Cortisol was low, DHEA was low, secretory IgA was low. And so 3 months later, I did another saliva test and cortisol and DHEA greatly improved, but secretory IgA didn't improve at all. And back then there was no AIP diet, so I was just following a regular paleo diet. But when I saw the secretory IgA was still depressed, I took a break from nuts and seeds, which I was eating at the time, and then retested secretory IgA a few months later, and it did go on to improve and normalize. And so again, things like that. If someone has, let's say, H. pylori or parasites, and ideally you want to address those. Now, I will say you're not necessarily looking for perfect tests. And as an example, if someone does a comprehensive stool panel, let's say a GI map or GIFX or another stool test, and they have a few opportunistic bacteria, but everything else looks good, those findings wouldn't prevent me from concluding that someone is in remission. Like if everything else looked good, but they had elevated streptococcus on a GI map, which is actually a common finding, or even like low akkermansia, which is also a common finding on these tests. Again, that to me, I wouldn't say, well, if they're not in remission because they don't have a perfect test. So there are different things that I would look for. Potential triggers is really what we're looking for. And we want to make sure those triggers have been removed, like severe underlying imbalances have been corrected. And to me, if all that, so if the thyroid's looking great, the antibodies looking better and ideally normalized, and those are Graves and Hashimoto's, the other underlying imbalances are also corrected, then, or the significant underlying imbalances, the triggers are removed and the significant underlying imbalances are addressed, then to me, yes, then we could conclude someone has healed their thyroid, restored their health. If you are looking to do everything you can to save your thyroid, in addition to watching my videos on YouTube, you also might want to subscribe to my free online newsletter, which is called Healthy Gut, Healthy Thyroid. Not only will you get the latest news on how to heal your gut and restore your thyroid health, but during each edition, I'll demonstrate a different blood or functional medicine test marker that relates to healing your gut and or your thyroid. There will also be an Ask Dr. Eric section where not only can you see questions that other people have asked related to gut and thyroid health, but you can also submit a question for me to answer in a future edition. To subscribe to the Healthy Gut, Healthy Thyroid newsletter, please visit savemythyroid.com/newsletter. But even after that, like when I dealt with Graves, it took me about 9 months before everything was normal, but I still wasn't sure if things were stable. So I did with the blood work and including the antibodies, in my case, the thyroid stimulating immunoglobulins. I wanted to do a couple of additional tests just to make sure that things were stable, because people can relapse and sometimes they do relapse. So yeah. So anyway, that's, I would say 2-3 months, definitely not realistic in most cases. Minimum 6 to 9 months, but a lot of times it takes much longer than that too. Like again, 12 to 15 months isn't uncommon. Again, everybody's different. And when I work with someone, my goal is to do everything I can to accelerate their healing. But of course, I want them to do everything they can, especially from a diet and lifestyle standpoint. And then when doing certain testing and I give recommendations, the hope is that the person will follow it. And so getting back to the question, is it possible to heal your thyroid gland in 3 months or less? Well, I mean, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it's, in most cases, it's unlikely. And I wouldn't have those types of, I wouldn't have those expectations when working with any practitioner, and especially dealing with thyroid autoimmunity, Graves, Hashimoto's. But even if you're dealing with a non-autoimmune thyroid condition, in most cases, it'll take some time. The exception might be a condition such as subacute thyroiditis, which is typically transient, although it is caused by a virus, and that could also return. So like you still want to do things to optimize your immune system, which arguably will take more than 2 to 3 months. But in that case, you might, within 3 months of becoming hyper, because that's typically subacute thyroiditis, you'll be hyperthyroid. And again, 3 months later, you might have normal thyroid hormones. Actually, it could be less than that, but completely different situation when compared to Graves, Hashimoto's, even toxic multinodular goiter. And so that's my answer to the question. Is it possible to heal your thyroid in 3 months or less? Again, not going to say impossible, but in most cases, it's going to take a lot longer than that. As usual, I hope you found this Q&A episode to be valuable, and I look forward to catching you in the next episode.